The moment Karen dialed the police, she thought she had already won. She stood in the middle of the quiet neighborhood street, arms crossed, face red with anger, shouting loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "You can't park here. This neighborhood has rules, and you're breaking them." I calmly leaned against my car and watched the scene unfold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the houses, and curtains began moving as curious neighbors peeked outside. Everyone knew Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA. She acted like she owned the entire street. But today, something felt different. Karen pointed directly at me like a prosecutor in a courtroom. "This man has been violating law regulations all week. I warned him twice, and now he refuses to move his vehicle. I'm calling the police." She dramatically waved her phone in the air as if she were announcing a victory. Some neighbors whispered to each other. Others watched silently, unsure whose side to take. I could have ended the situation immediately. One simple sentence would have stopped everything. But instead, I stayed quiet. Because sometimes the truth is more powerful when it reveals itself. Karen continued her performance. "You think you're above the rules," she sneered. "People like you think they can do whatever they want." I smiled slightly but said nothing. 10 minutes later, the distant sound of a police siren echoed through the neighborhood. Karen straightened up proudly. "Good," she said loudly. "Now we'll see who's right." 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached us. The taller officer looked around at the gathering crowd. "What seems to be the problem here?" Karen jumped forward before anyone else could speak. "This man refuses to follow law rules. He's illegally parked and causing problems in our community." The officer turned toward me calmly. "Sir, is that true?" I looked at the officer, then briefly at Karen, who wore the smug expression of someone expecting an easy victory. Then I answered, "Well, officer, I'd be happy to explain." Karen interrupted immediately. "There's nothing to explain. He broke the rules." The second officer raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, let him speak." The street became completely silent. Neighbors leaned closer, eager to hear what I would say next. Karen folded her arms again, confident she had already won. But the officers didn't know something yet. And Karen definitely didn't know either. Something that was about to turn the entire situation upside down. I reached slowly into my jacket pocket. Karen's smile widened. She clearly believed I was about to pull out an excuse. Instead, I pulled out my wallet. Inside was a small identification card. The officer glanced down at it. Then his eyes widened slightly. Karen leaned forward impatiently. "Well, are you going to arrest him or not?" The officer looked at her, then back at me. And that was the moment everything changed. Because Karen had just called the police on the one person she never expected. The judge. The officer held the identification card in his hand for a moment longer than expected. His eyes moved from the card, to me, then back to the card again. A subtle shift appeared in his expression, one that Karen didn't notice yet. But I did. The second officer leaned closer and quietly asked, "Everything all right?" The first officer nodded slowly and handed the card back to me with a respectful tone. "Thank you, Your Honor." The moment the words left his mouth, the entire atmosphere on the street changed. Karen blinked. Once, twice. Her confident smile froze like a statue. "You're, what?" she asked, clearly confused. The officer turned toward her calmly. "Ma'am, this gentleman is a judge." A ripple of whispers spread through the neighbors like a sudden gust of wind. Did he just say judge? No way. Karen called the police on a judge. Karen's face went pale. For the first time since the argument started, she didn't have anything to say. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who backed down easily. Her pride wouldn't allow it. "That doesn't matter," she said quickly, forcing confidence back into her voice. "Rules are rules. Law regulations apply to everyone." I nodded slightly. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. The officers watched the exchange carefully. Karen pointed at my car again. "That vehicle has been parked there for 3 days. It's against law rules." I told him to move it. The officer glanced toward my car, then back at me. "Sir, would you like to explain the situation?" I took a breath and looked down the quiet suburban street. It was a peaceful neighborhood. Tree-lined sidewalks, well-kept lawns, children's bicycles leaning against driveways. The kind of place where problems were usually small. But sometimes small problems reveal bigger ones. Yes, officer, I said. I'd be glad to explain. Karen scoffed loudly. This should be simple. He broke the rules. I turned toward her politely. Actually, Karen, the situation is a little more complicated than that. Her eyebrows tightened. How do you know my name? I smiled slightly. Because I've been paying attention. Karen shifted uncomfortably but quickly recovered. Well, I've been paying attention too, she snapped. You moved here 2 weeks ago, and you've already started ignoring HOA policies. The neighbors leaned closer. Everyone was listening now. I gestured calmly toward the street. The reason my car has been parked there is because the driveway of the house I purchased is currently under repair. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. That's not my problem. I know, I replied evenly. But the HOA approved the temporary parking permit. Karen froze. What? I continued calmly. I received written approval 3 days ago. The officer raised an eyebrow. Do you have documentation for that, sir? I reached into my jacket pocket again and pulled out a folded paper. The officer examined it carefully. Karen stepped closer, trying to see. The officer nodded slowly. This appears legitimate. Karen's face turned red. That can't be right, she protested. I'm on the HOA committee. I never saw that. I looked directly at her. That's interesting. Karen crossed her arms defensively. Why? I paused for a moment before answering. Because the approval was signed by the HOA president. Karen frowned. Well, obviously. I tilted my head slightly. Which is strange. The officer looked curious. Why is that strange, sir? I gave a small smile. Because according to the county records, the HOA president resigned last month. The officer blinked. Karen's face suddenly lost all color. And that was when the officers realized something much bigger was happening. Karen's confidence didn't disappear all at once. It cracked, like thin ice slowly breaking under pressure. That's ridiculous, she said quickly. Our HOA president did not resign. The officer looked between us. Sir, you mentioned county records. I nodded calmly. Yes, officer. When I purchased the property 2 weeks ago, I reviewed all official HOA filings with the county clerk. Karen laughed nervously. Oh please. No one does that. I met her eyes. Judges do. A few neighbors chuckled quietly. Karen's jaw tightened. The officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, do you know who the current HOA president is? Karen answered immediately. Of course I do. It's Robert Hensley. The officer wrote the name down. And you're certain he's still serving? Karen crossed her arms again. Absolutely. I folded my hands calmly. That would be difficult. Karen snapped back instantly. Why? I paused briefly. Because Robert Hensley filed his official resignation with the county 4 weeks ago. The officer looked up. You're sure about that? Yes, I said. It's public record. The second officer pulled out a tablet from the patrol car and began typing. Karen shifted nervously. Well, maybe he hasn't told everyone yet. The officer continued scrolling. The quiet clicking of the screen suddenly stopped. He looked up. Well, according to county filings, Mr. Hensley did resign. A wave of murmurs spread through the watching neighbors. Karen blinked rapidly. That doesn't make sense. I nodded slightly. You're right, it doesn't. The first officer looked thoughtful. Ma'am, if the HOA president resigned, who has been approving documents? Karen hesitated. Well, the committee handles things. Which committee? The officer asked. Karen gestured vaguely. The neighborhood committee. I tilted my head. Interesting. Karen glared at me. What's that supposed to mean? I looked back at the officer. The HOA bylaws clearly state that temporary permits must be signed by the acting president or a legally appointed interim officer. The officer nodded slowly. That's correct in many associations. Karen suddenly pointed at the paper again. Then how does he have approval? The officer examined the signature. Sir, this signature says, Robert Hensley. Yes, I replied calmly. Karen's voice rose. See, that proves it. I watched her for a moment. Then I asked a very simple question. Karen, when did you last speak with Robert Hensley? She hesitated. Last month. And did he mention resigning? No. The second officer spoke up. There's something else here. Everyone turned toward him. He rotated the tablet so the other officer could see. According to this filing, Mr. Hensley didn't just resign. Karen frowned. What do you mean? The officer continued reading. He resigned after filing a formal complaint about unauthorized HOA actions. Karen's posture stiffened. What complaint? The officer read the line carefully. It says several committee members were issuing enforcement notices without legal authority. The neighbors whispered again. Karen's voice sharpened. That's not illegal. I spoke calmly. No, but it can become illegal if fines are issued improperly. The officer looked at Karen. Ma'am, are you one of the committee members issuing these notices? Karen hesitated again. Well, yes. The officer asked the next question carefully. Were you aware that the HOA currently has no legally registered president? Karen's eyes widened. No. The officer looked at me again. Sir, when exactly did you receive this permit? 3 days ago, I answered. Karen pointed again. Then Robert must have signed it before he resigned. I gave a small smile. That would be impossible. Karen's voice rose again. Why? I looked directly at the officer. Because Robert Hensley passed away 2 weeks ago. The entire street went silent. Karen's face turned completely white. And suddenly the permit in the officer's hand meant something very different. The silence that followed felt heavy. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Karen stared at the paper in the officer's hands like it had suddenly turned into something dangerous. That's impossible, she whispered. The officer looked down at the permit again. Sir, are you absolutely certain about Mr. Hensley? I nodded calmly. Yes. His obituary was published in the county paper 14 days ago. One of the neighbors spoke quietly from the sidewalk. I remember that. He had a heart attack. Another neighbor nodded. Yeah, it was sudden. Karen looked around nervously as the whispers grew louder. But this permit has his signature, she said, pointing again. The officer raised an eyebrow. That's exactly the issue. The second officer examined the paper more closely. Sir, where did you receive this document? From the HOA office mailbox, I answered. It was delivered the morning after I submitted the request. Karen shook her head. No. That doesn't make sense. The officer looked at her carefully. Ma'am, who currently has access to the HOA office? Karen hesitated. Well, the committee does. And who is on that committee? Karen swallowed. Me, and 2 others. The officer waited. Names, please. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Daniel Carter and Melissa Boyd. The officer wrote them down. Do either of them handle permit approvals? Karen shook her head quickly. No, only the president does. The officer tapped the paper. But the president was already deceased when this permit was issued. Karen looked trapped between panic and denial. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe the date is wrong. I stepped forward slightly. The date isn't wrong. Karen glared at me. How would you know? I answered calmly. Because the HOA mailbox has a security camera. Karen's eyes widened instantly. The officer noticed. A camera. Yes, I said. Installed last year after several packages went missing. The second officer's interest grew. So whoever delivered this permit should appear on the footage. Karen suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Well, cameras don't always work, she said quickly. I smiled slightly. This one does. The officer nodded. That would definitely help clarify things. Karen crossed her arms again, trying to regain control. You're making a big deal out of nothing. But her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. The officer turned toward her again. Ma'am, did you personally handle this permit request? Karen hesitated. Well, I might have seen it. Might have. The officer asked. Karen shifted her weight. I get a lot of paperwork. The officer looked back at the document. Because right now we have a permit signed by a man who had already passed away. He paused. And that raises some serious questions. The neighbors whispered louder now. Someone quietly said, forgery. Karen heard it. That's ridiculous, she snapped. I kept my voice calm. No one has accused you of anything yet. Karen pointed at me angrily. You're clearly trying to trap me. The officer raised a hand. Ma'am, please relax. Karen's breathing had become faster. This is harassment. The officer looked directly at her. No, ma'am, this is simply an investigation. He then turned to his partner. Let's check that camera footage. Karen's head snapped toward him. You don't need to do that. The officer raised an eyebrow. And why not? Karen opened her mouth, then quickly closed it again. For the first time since the argument started, she looked genuinely afraid. Because if the camera footage showed what I suspected, then this argument about a parked car was about to become something much bigger. And Karen seemed to realize it. Karen's nervous energy became impossible to hide. She shifted from one foot to the other while the officers discussed checking the HOA office camera. That really isn't necessary, she insisted again, forcing a weak smile. This whole thing is a misunderstanding. The first officer looked at her calmly. Maybe it is. That's exactly why we verify. The second officer turned toward me. Sir, how far is the HOA office from here? Just 2 blocks, I replied. Next to the community pool. The officer nodded. That's convenient. Several neighbors began quietly following behind as we walked down the street. Word had already spread, and curiosity was pulling people closer like gravity. Karen walked a few steps behind the officers, unusually quiet now. When we reached the small brick HOA office building, the officer stopped at the door. Who has the key? He asked. Karen hesitated again. I do. She slowly pulled a key from her purse and unlocked the door. Inside, the office was small but organized, file cabinets along one wall, a desk in the center, and a security monitor mounted in the corner. The second officer walked straight toward the monitor. That the camera system? Karen nodded stiffly. Yes. The officer leaned closer and began navigating the playback menu. What date did you say the permit was delivered? He asked. 3 days ago, I answered. He scrolled through the recordings. The room grew silent except for the faint clicking of buttons. Karen's breathing sounded louder than anything else. Finally the officer stopped. Here we go. He pressed play. The screen showed the front of the HOA mailbox mounted outside the office door. The timestamp read 7:42 a.m. For several seconds nothing happened. Then someone appeared on the screen. A woman walked into frame. Karen. She froze. The officer paused the video. Well, that answers part of the question. Karen's voice trembled slightly. I was just checking the mail. The officer nodded slowly. Let's keep watching. He pressed play again. The video showed Karen opening the mailbox and pulling out several envelopes. She sorted through them briefly. Then she pulled out one particular document. The permit request I had submitted. The officer paused again. Looks like she's reviewing the request. Karen forced a laugh. That's normal. Committee members review requests all the time. Sure, the officer said. Let's continue. The video resumed. Karen looked around the empty parking lot for a moment. Then she went inside the office. The officers exchanged a glance. A few seconds later, the camera captured Karen returning outside. But now she was holding the same document. Only something had changed. The officer paused the screen again and zoomed in. Interesting. Karen stared at the monitor, her face pale. What? She said nervously. The officer pointed at the screen. When you came out, the paper was folded differently. Karen shrugged quickly. That doesn't prove anything. The officer nodded. You're right. He hit play again. Karen walked over to the mailbox. She slipped the paper inside. Then she closed the box and walked out of frame. The officer stopped the video. Sir, he said to me, is that the same mailbox where you found your permit? Yes. The officer leaned back slowly. So the permit was placed in the mailbox by Karen. Karen immediately protested. That's not illegal. The officer remained calm. No, ma'am. He looked down at the permit again. But signing someone else's name might be. Karen's eyes widened in panic. I didn't sign anything. The officer looked at the paused screen. Well, he zoomed further into the image. Karen inside the office, sitting at the desk, holding a pen, writing on the document. The room went completely silent. Because the camera had just captured the moment the signature was written. And it definitely wasn't Robert Hensley. For a long moment, no one in the HOA office spoke. The paused image on the monitor showed Karen clearly seated at the desk, pen in hand, writing on the permit document. The officer slowly turned toward her. Ma'am, would you like to explain what we're seeing? Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The neighbors behind us shifted uncomfortably. A few quietly whispered to each other. This isn't good. She signed it. Karen finally forced out a sentence. I was just processing the request. The officer nodded slightly. Processing? By signing the former president's name. Karen shook her head quickly. No, I didn't sign his name. The officer pointed to the screen. Then what exactly were you writing? Karen's voice became defensive again. I was making notes. The second officer zoomed further into the footage. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but one thing stood out unmistakably. Karen's hand carefully forming letters. The officer looked down at the permit document again. Then back at the screen. Then back at the document. The handwriting matched. Karen saw the realization on his face. You can't prove that, she snapped. I spoke calmly from the side. Actually, handwriting analysis can. Karen spun toward me angrily. You set this up. I shook my head. No, Karen, you set this up when you called the police. The first officer stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you a very direct question. Karen crossed her arms again. What? Did you sign Robert Hensley's name on this permit? Karen hesitated. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then she said quietly, no. The officer nodded slowly. All right. He then looked at his partner. Let's take another look at the footage. The video resumed. Inside the office, Karen sat at the desk with the document. She looked around the empty room. Then she leaned forward and began writing. When she finished, she lifted the page and examined it carefully. Then she placed it inside an envelope. The officer paused the footage again. That appears to be the permit. Karen's breathing grew heavier. You're twisting things. The officer remained calm. Ma'am, we're simply observing the evidence. The second officer asked another question. Do you normally sign documents for the HOA? Karen shook her head. No. Then why were you writing on the permit request? Karen's voice cracked slightly. I told you, I was making notes. I looked at the officer. May I say something? He nodded. Go ahead, sir. I spoke calmly. Karen told the officers earlier that HOA permits must be signed by the president. The officer nodded. She did. And she also said no one else has that authority. The officer glanced toward Karen. That's correct. I gestured toward the monitor. Which means Karen knew exactly how the process worked. Karen suddenly realized where this was going. You're manipulating the situation. But the officer was already thinking ahead. Ma'am, if you're not authorized to sign permits. He lifted the document again. Then how did this signature appear on the approval? Karen stayed silent. The officer's voice became firmer. Because from what we're seeing. He pointed at the screen. It appears you wrote something on that document while alone in the office. Karen's composure finally began to crack. Her hands trembled slightly. This is ridiculous, she whispered. The officer looked at her seriously. Forgery is not ridiculous, ma'am. The word hung in the air like thunder. Forgery. The neighbors gasped quietly. Karen's face drained of color. And suddenly the small argument about a parked car had turned into something far more serious. Because now the officers weren't just dealing with a neighborhood dispute. They were dealing with a possible crime. And Karen was running out of explanations. The word, forgery, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Karen looked as if the ground beneath her had suddenly disappeared. I didn't forge anything, she said quickly, but her voice had lost the sharp authority it carried earlier. Now it sounded thin, fragile. The officer remained calm. Ma'am, we're not making final conclusions yet. But the situation raises serious concerns. The second officer held the permit up beside the paused footage on the screen. When someone signs another person's name on an official document without authorization, that can qualify as forgery. Karen shook her head again. You don't understand. I was trying to help the neighborhood. I watched quietly. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be forced. It simply unfolds. The officer asked carefully. Help the neighborhood how? Karen swallowed. Well, the HOA has been falling apart since Robert passed away. Someone had to keep things running. The officer nodded. I understand. But that still doesn't explain the signature. Karen rubbed her forehead nervously. I just approved the request so the paperwork would be complete. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. So you did sign it? Karen froze. She realized too late what she had just admitted. I mean, no, that's not what I meant. But the officer had already heard enough. He looked toward his partner. Did you hear that? The second officer nodded slowly. Yes. Karen's panic grew. You're twisting my words. The officer kept his voice steady. Ma'am, you just stated you approved the request to complete the paperwork. Karen shook her head frantically. I was speaking generally. Behind us, Neighbors stood silent. The woman who once shouted the loudest now looked smaller than anyone else in the room. The officer placed the permit carefully on the desk. Let's walk through this step by step. Karen said nothing. You stated earlier that only the HOA president can approve permits. Karen nodded weakly. Yes. The president had already passed away. Another slow nod. Yes. You were seen on camera writing on the permit. Karen's breathing became shallow. I was making notes. The officer tapped the signature line. And yet the document contains the president's signature. Karen looked at the desk. Her shoulders slumped. The confidence she carried all afternoon was completely gone now. The officer spoke gently but firmly. Karen, did you sign Robert Hensley's name? The room stayed silent. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Finally Karen whispered, I just wanted the rules enforced. The officer exhaled slowly. That's not an answer. Karen looked up, tears forming in her eyes. You don't understand what it's like managing this neighborhood. The officer remained steady. Ma'am, I'm asking you one final time. He pointed at the permit. Did you sign his name? Karen stared at the paper. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes. The neighbors gasped quietly. The officer nodded. Thank you for your honesty. Karen suddenly realized what she had just done. Her eyes widened. Wait, but the officer had already reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. We may have a document forgery situation. Karen's panic returned instantly. You can't arrest me for that. The officer looked at her calmly. Ma'am, we're not arresting you yet. Karen blinked. Then what are you doing? The officer gestured toward the permit. We're starting an official investigation. Karen's knees seemed to weaken slightly. Because the moment she admitted the truth, everything had changed. Karen stood frozen beside the desk, staring at the permit like it was the most dangerous piece of paper she had ever seen. A few minutes earlier she had been shouting confidently in the street, convinced she was about to prove someone wrong. Now the entire situation had turned against her. The officer calmly finished speaking with dispatch over the radio and then turned back toward her. Ma'am, we're going to need to document everything that happened here today. Karen's voice trembled. You're treating me like a criminal. The officer answered carefully. No, ma'am, we're treating this like a legal matter. The neighbors remained gathered near the doorway, watching quietly. The second officer picked up the permit again and placed it into a clear evidence sleeve. Karen noticed immediately. Evidence? She asked nervously. The officer nodded. Yes. Her breathing became faster. This is ridiculous. It was just a neighborhood permit. I finally stepped forward again. Actually, Karen, it's more than that. She glared at me. You've caused enough trouble already. I kept my voice calm. No. The trouble began when you started issuing law enforcement notices without legal authority. Several neighbors exchanged looks. One of them spoke up quietly. She fined my family last month for parking overnight. Another neighbor added, she threatened us with penalties for putting up a basketball hoop. The officer looked around the room. How many residents received notices like that? Hands slowly began to raise. Karen's eyes widened in shock. That was my job, she insisted. Someone had to enforce the rules. The officer shook his head. Not without legal authority. He turned toward the growing group of neighbors. If the HOA didn't have a registered president, then enforcement actions may not have been valid. Murmurs filled the room. Karen stepped back. You're all overreacting. But no one was listening anymore. The officer looked at his partner. We'll need copies of those notices. Then he turned to Karen again. Ma'am, based on what we've seen today, there may be multiple issues involving HOA authority and document handling. Karen's voice cracked. So what happens now? The officer answered honestly. The documentation will be forwarded to the county office and the district attorney for review. Karen looked terrified. That means court. I nodded slightly. Yes. She stared at me in disbelief. You planned this. I shook my head. No, Karen. You planned it when you called the police. The officer stepped toward the door. For now, you're free to go home. But you may be contacted for further questioning. Karen slowly walked outside. The confident HOA enforcer who had shouted in the street earlier was gone. In her place stood someone overwhelmed by the consequences of her own actions. The neighbors remained silent as she passed. Then the officer turned toward me. Well, Your Honor, he said with a small smile, that's not how most parking complaints end. I smiled slightly. No, but sometimes the law has a way of revealing the truth.
Outside, the quiet neighborhood street looked exactly the same as it had that afternoon, but one thing had changed. Karen had called the police expecting to enforce the rules. Instead, she had just learned what the rules really mean. Don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments.